even absent nuclear weapons, the Iranians have cards to play. But the Israelis act like they can just slap the Iranians around. It has no real consequences. And to the extent that it might have consequences, Iran's going to fall apart, much the way Syria did. I wouldn't bet a lot of money on that.
So recently, John Mearsheimer went on Katie Halper's podcast to talk a little bit about the fact that Israel and the United States are now worse off with Iran than they were before the 12-day war, than they were before the recent bombing campaign. Mearsheimer gets into the dynamics at play in terms of geopolitics and how these ramifications are going to affect both Trump and Netanyahu in the years to come. So let's get his take on this. Please like the video and subscribe to the channel.
The idea that Israel is going to have perfect security by beating up on every state in the region and breaking countries apart like Syria and Iran and Egypt and maybe Turkey is a pipe dream. That's not going to happen. And Israel, in the process, is going to do enormous damage to itself. It's going to end up fighting wars forever and ever. And this is not in Israel's interest, especially since those adversaries are eventually going to get the military capability to threaten Israel in serious ways. And the best example of this is the case of Iran.
Yeah, I got to agree with Mearsheimer so far, especially when it comes to Syria. Remember, Syria agreed to share some resources with Israel as an ostensive ally when Israel decided to bomb Iran. And since then, we've seen relations break down with that regime, with the Jilani government, the radical Sunni, former member of al-Qaeda that fought U.S. forces in Iraq, and then went to Syria and founded an al-Qaeda affiliate there. Well, now he leads the country, and Israel bombed Syria. He's tormenting and torturing and executing Christians and Druze there. So yeah, they're already off to a bad foot with Syria just a month after that. And it wants to expand the West Bank settlements that both lay claim to parts of Lebanon and Syria. You're seeing these relations break down. Iran's the primary example, too. That situation hasn't gone away. If anything, it's worse now than before, because now Iranians are incentivized to get a nuclear weapon. They've retained control of their regime, and, this is backward logic. There's no success here, despite the Trump administration trying to celebrate it as such. Relations with Iran have been broken off. There's no chance for a new inspections regime, and IAEA inspectors are now kicked out.
The Israelis are running around, and of course Donald Trump is as well, and many hawks in the United States, saying that we have just delivered this hammer blow to Iran. We have obliterated their nuclear program. They're never going to get nuclear weapons. And if they make any steps in that direction, we'll just go back in and slam them again. I wouldn't bet a lot of money on that. I think that the Iranian nuclear program is alive. The Iranians remain committed to at least enriching uranium. And I would be willing to bet that behind closed doors, they're committed to developing a bomb. They're not going to advertise that, certainly not at this point in time. But I would not be surprised for 1 second. In fact, I think it's likely that they will develop a bomb.
Yeah, who wouldn't after what's happened, especially recently? And I think he's right. There are indications that they were able to get some of the enriched uranium out of Fordow. That was one of the 3 facilities bombed. No one doubts that much of those locations were reduced to rubble, but you have satellite imagery that the Gray Zone unveiled showing that there were huge motorcades there weeks in advance, presumably to take that enriched uranium out. I don't know if they could have gotten the centrifuges, but they certainly seem to have preserved their nuclear enrichment program, which they were never going to give up. That was a non-starter in the first place. And when the Trump administration shifted from, hey, you can't have a nuclear weapon program to, hey, you can't enrich uranium at all, that sent a signal that, there wasn't going to be any deal. And probably, that's when Trump had decided to collude with Netanyahu to bomb Iran rather than coming to a peaceful agreement that would have normalized relations. And Netanyahu took advantage of the timing here to prevent that agreement from happening. Remember, he hated the JCPOA because it took the pretext that he wanted to use for regime change in Iran. So yeah, I mostly agree with Mearsheimer here. There were also 7 or 8 years between the time in which the JCPOA was ended from the US side by Trump to the time in which they had to, get some of their nuclear enrichment infrastructure out of where it was known to be. So I think that this is just a setback for U.S.-Iranian relations and Israeli-Iranian relations. It's no victory, and it's only a matter of time until the Israelis under Netanyahu and the neocons clamor for regime change there once again. They've been doing it almost my entire life. They'll be seconds, weeks, months away from developing a nuke again. It'll be a kerfuffle again. You can bet your bottom dollar on that.
So Israel hasn't solved this problem. In fact, they've made the situation worse. And the idea that they've won this great victory against Iran, or that we won this great victory against Iran, is simply not true. If anything, the key question is why the Iranians agreed to a ceasefire. If I had been playing the Iranians' hand, I would not have agreed to a ceasefire. I would have let the war go on for a couple more weeks. The Israelis were in real trouble because huge amounts of damage were being done to Israeli territory. And furthermore, the Israelis were running out of defensive missiles. And there was no shortage of ballistic missiles and drones and cruise missiles on the Iranian side. So one could make a good argument that the Iranians should have continued the war. All of this is to say that if the Israelis and the Americans start the war up again, I wouldn't bet that Israel and the United States are going to win that war. Just to take this one step further, and this is where the Americans come into play, it's quite clear that one of the reasons that Trump wanted to shut the war down after the June 22 attacks was because there was evidence that the Iranians were going to mine the Persian Gulf, the Straits of Hormuz. And that really spooked Trump, as it should have. All of this is to say that if we have another conflict, there's a possibility that the Iranians will mine the Straits. And if they mine the Straits and we have a huge economic crisis, this will not be good for anyone on the planet, and certainly for the Trump administration.
Yeah, agreed. That's another side effect, another angle that a lot of people aren't talking about regarding this war too, is that the Iranians proved that you can have punched holes in the Iron Dome. They did get some ballistic missiles through, and they were able to touch some of Israel's infrastructure, and they were running out of missiles. So this is a test case showing that if Israel is attacked, despite the fact that at first, Americans were told, hey, Israel's got this. This is Israel's thing. They're doing it on their own. The U.S. is just a support role. Israel's still going to clamor to Big Brother in the form of the United States for military aid, missiles, intelligence, etc. And they could still do damage to Israel despite all that. So this is not good for Israel's future security if you have a vested interest in protecting Israel rather than just antagonizing all of your neighbors like Israel has done, not only there, but also in Lebanon, Syria, and Yemen since October 7th alone.
So the point is that even absent nuclear weapons, the Iranians have cards to play. But the Israelis act like they can just slap the Iranians around. It has no real consequences. And to the extent that it might have consequences, Iran's going to fall apart, much the way Syria did. I wouldn't bet a lot of money on that. And I could go on and on with regard to this.
Yeah, I happen to agree with them. It seems like the masses are generally galvanized in support of the Iranian regime, too. There's no uprising or threat of rebellion that we've seen, despite the fact that the CIA and Mossad apparently tried to foment that by calling top Iranian leaders and say, hey, surrender or else, we're going to kill your family. We know where they are. Well, that didn't happen.
We could talk about the centrifugal forces that are at play inside of Israel itself. This is not a happy society. This is a society that has wicked fault lines, and the animosity across those fault lines is not to be underestimated. And when you fight wars all the time like this, it invariably exacerbates those antagonisms. So I think if you look at the body politic and you look at Israel's situation in the broader region, I think the idea that they're in great shape and they just need to apply a little bit more force and get a little bit more support from the United States is not the way you want to look at this.
Exactly, especially in relation to the PR disaster that is Gaza, the bloodbath, the genocide that is Gaza, and has world opinion shifting against them notwithstanding all of these wars. Those are just in addition to all of that madness that's being directed there right now.
So why did Iran not do what you were suggesting they could have and should have done, do you think?
It's very hard to say exactly what was going on. I mean, it seems to me that the Americans were probably talking to the Russians and to the Chinese, and the Russians and the Chinese were talking to the Iranians, and they were probably putting pressure on the Iranians to shut this one down. You want to remember that the Chinese get a lot of oil out of the Gulf, and the Chinese did not want to see the Straits of Hormuz shut down. So they had an incentive to put an end to this war. I think the Russians worry about the war as well. They don't want to get dragged in. They don't have any real deep seated interest. So I wouldn't be surprised if the Iranians were getting pressure from the Russians and the Chinese. The other thing is that almost all of the reporting on Iran tells us that there is a pretty profound split inside Iran between hardliners and softliners. And there are actually a lot of people inside of Iran who want to have good relations with the West. And in fact, I think these people would be willing to work out some sort of modus vivendi with the Israelis if the Israelis would shut down the genocide. But there is, a moderate wing inside of Iran. And I wouldn't be surprised if they made the case as well that we should shut this down now.
Yeah, I mean, you'll never hear that in the mainstream media, which exists just to drumbeat for war and regime change in Iran. But Mearsheimer is correct there, too. And there are vestiges of, a more pro-Western society that existed there prior to the Iranian Revolution of 78 and 79, when fundamentalists overthrew the Shah that was installed by the U.S. in 1953 because the Shah was developing a police state and a censorship regime and cracking down on individual freedoms despite, the auspices of a more pro-Western society. And there were tangible elements of it that there were. I'm going to add one thing to what Mearsheimer is saying here. I believe that the Iranians believed that regime change was on the table. When Trump was talking about that on Truth Social, Trump had also, issued a directive to evacuate the entire city of Tehran. That's a city of 9 million people, and I think combined with the outskirts is something like 14 million. That's a pretty serious thing to disrupt the day-to-day behavior of people that aren't even involved in the government of Iran. And I think the regime must have thought a major strike may have come, and this was the best way to avert that. This, absurd reprisal attack, if you could even call it an attack, where you're tipping Trump off to the fact that, hey, we have to make a demonstration of return fire here, but we're not going to kill anyone. That's exactly what happened.
And if need be, we can go back to fighting the war. We have the missiles to do that. So that'd be my best guess as to what happened here.
So this may be a kind of basic question, but I'm genuinely confused about how rational acting works in the real world. Is it that states act rationally, but for certain things like ideology or like extenuating circumstances or the lobby? Because you just gave a bunch of examples of, like, for the United States and Israel, that what they're doing is it's not rational, correct? So how does this work?
Well, just focusing on the American case, which is what I was talking about. The first point you want to remember is that states don't always act rationally. Uh, Sebastian Rosado and I wrote this book that argues states act rationally most of the time, but there are exceptions for sure. If you were to look at the Bay of Pigs operation, which President Kennedy executed shortly after he took office, he came into office on January 1961, and then he launched the Bay of Pigs operation in April of 1961. It was a total fiasco. And it is very easy to prove that that was a non-rational or irrational decision. So the point I'm making to you, Katie, is that there are examples out there. Now, I think, as I said before, that if you look at American policy toward Israel, whether it's under Joe Biden or it's under Donald Trump, it does not make strategic sense. It's not rational. And in almost all cases, the reason states pursue non rational strategies or irrational strategies is because of domestic politics. Domestic politics overwhelm strategic calculations. And in this case, it's the lobby. The lobby, as you know, is enormously influential in the United States.
Yeah, he said it, and that's true. He literally wrote the book on this subject called The Israel Lobby with Stephen Walt. It's an excellent book. I recommend to anyone watching this. But he's right. It's the ownership over U.S. politicians that AIPAC has. And it's not just over U.S. politicians, it's also over mainstream media organizations that only depict Israel in a positive light generally. You know, don't show you any of the screenshots or videos coming out of Gaza, that's for sure. You only get that out of, you know, independent media or TikTok. That's why they want to ban TikTok, by the way, and might eventually be able to do that despite, you know, prolonging it for a while. So yeah, he's right. AIPAC lays claim to something like 350 or 400 legislators that always vote indiscriminately for aid to Israel, without exceptions, without, you know, conditions behind the payments. It's the biggest bipartisan foreign policy AIDS package program and AIDS package structure that exists in the United States today. So he is right that clouds the foreign policy judgment of people that are elected, and the continuity between administrations is not much different, because whether you have, you know, Biden or Trump in office, and this goes for, you know, Obama and Bush and, you know, all the other presidents, you still had the Israel lobby there to guide the decision making of the politicians, the bureaucrats, and the media.
It's much less influential these days at controlling the discourse, as is evidenced by the fact that you and I are having this conversation, which tens of thousands of people will watch. So, in terms of controlling the discourse, the lobby is in deep trouble. But in terms of influencing policymakers, they basically have every policymaker or almost every policymaker in their back pocket. And it doesn't matter whether you have Joe Biden in the White House, Hillary Clinton,
Yeah.
Donald Trump, you name it. The lobby gets its way with policymakers. And that's domestic politics at play. And in those cases, you will find instances of irrationality. And this is certainly a case of irrationality.
Yeah, I think Mearsheimer's right there, and you can see the power and sway they have over politicians is evidenced by the fact that, you know, those who go against this are just automatically branded anti-Semitic. Just go, you know, to the lowest possible blow you have to get away from any reasonable dissent that one might have toward U.S. aid to Israel or Israel in general, even in, you know, singular issues that are wrapped up in Israel, like the war in Iran or the genocide in Gaza. You know, criticizing any of these things, or even Netanyahu himself, is just asking and making yourself a magnet for accusations of anti-Semitism. That's how they deal with this. That's how they've dealt with this a long time. I do agree with Mearsheimer for, you know, bringing in that sense of optimism a little bit about how the discourse is changing. They don't have a monopoly on the information revolving around this topic anymore. Not at all. I mean, it's even a lot different in the last 4 years, let alone decade, where you have independent media actually covering this with a critical eye, with a skeptical eye, and even figures on the right like Marjorie Taylor Greene and Thomas Massey are standing up against this Israel first mentality in AIPAC and talking about how AIPAC's essentially a foreign lobby and should register under FARA like any other foreign lobby. I mean, imagine if Russia had a foreign lobby in the U.S. like AIPAC, or China did. They would immediately be called traitors. And they would immediately, anyone supporting that would immediately be called the worst possible names imaginable. This just wouldn't hold power over the U.S. But when it comes to AIPAC and the Israel lobby, there's a special carve out, just like there is for nuclear weapons for Israel. Israel stole their nuclear weapons that they have now and their program, which they don't admit to, by the way, because that would subject, you know, them to IAEA regulations and such. They stole it from the U.S. It was called the Domina Project. And Mearsheimer mentioned JFK earlier in the context of the Bay of Pigs. JFK actually tried to shut this down. There's correspondence between him and Ben-Gurion talking about this at the time, and there's evidence that he tried to shut that down. He wasn't successful, and he was murdered a few months after he tried to shut that down, by the way. What do you know? But Mearsheimer's right here. The Israel lobby is powerful, it holds sway, and U.S. policy toward Israel will remain the same until there's, maybe a cultural change in how people perceive this. I see that happening right now, especially among younger people, younger dissidents, younger even right-wingers talking about this. Older conservatives, that have watched Fox News their entire lives, or, a lot of it, because Fox News has only been around, 30 years? But a lot of those people do drift to the pro-Israel Zionist sentiment no matter what. But younger conservatives are changing their minds. And, left-wing dissidents have always been good on this. And it was one of the biggest disappointments, I think, for much of the left-wing populace in America, that Kamala Harris basically ignored this topic or didn't differentiate herself at all compared to Trump and his policy toward Israel. So you get Israel first, no matter who you vote for. No matter who you vote for, you always get John McCain. And regardless of the names, the deep state remains the same. That's what we're seeing, and that's what we've got cooking for U.S. foreign policy. So I want to hear from you, though, down below. Let me know, is the U.S. on better ground when it comes to Iran than they were before the war? Is Israel? What is the mentality or the bonus or benefit of the support to Israel movement? Let me know in the comments below. Do you think I'm missing anything? I'd love to hear from you. And please like the video, subscribe to the channel, subscribe to Katie Halper too. Really appreciated her podcast here with Mearsheimer. And please consider becoming a YouTube member by clicking the join button below. If you do that and support the channel, I'll graciously appreciate it. And in return, I'll give you access to all my videos before they go live on YouTube. And until I see you guys next time, no more war, no more debt, no more inflation, and no more empire. Peace out, guys. Catch you in the next one.